The ink was faded, almost a ghost on the yellowed paper, but the name was unmistakable. There were 33 names with a check mark beside them, and then one, the 34th, crossed out with a violence that tore the fiber of the page, and next to it, 4 words that froze the blood in my veins. The bloodline escaped. It was then, in the tomb-like silence of the abandoned office, that I heard a child's whisper from the dark hallway, and it whispered my last name. Morrison. To understand that whisper, you have to understand the silence that came before it. You have to understand the obsession that drove me to a place where silence had teeth. My name is Arthur Morrison, and I make my living telling stories that are already over. Some call me a journalist, others a historian of the macabre. I think of myself as more of a ghoul with a notepad, an archaeologist of sorrows, digging for the bones of narratives that the world has been content to bury. My obsession with Blackwood began, as many do, not with a bang, but with a footnote in a dusty, forgotten corner of the Boston Athenaeum. I was researching a piece on the philanthropic endeavors of New England's Gilded Age industrialists, a dry and rather tedious subject when I saw it. A footnote on a page detailing land grants for charitable institutions mentioned, in passing, the unfortunate and still unexplained Blackwood affair of 1892. That was it. No other details, no context. It was a dangling thread on the tapestry of history, a small, deliberate imprecision in an otherwise meticulously documented text. For most, it would have been nothing. For me, it was a siren's call, a discordant note in a symphony of orchestrated forgetting. That night, I didn't sleep. I descended into the archives, a subterranean world smelling of decaying paper and time itself. My fingers, gray with the dust of forgotten newsprint, traced the ghostly headlines of a bygone era. The story that emerged was stark, impossible, and utterly captivating. On the night of November 16, 1892, the Blackwood Orphanage, a private institution housing 33 children and a small staff of 7, had simply ceased to be. The articles were baffled, their language a testament to a world grappling with a mystery that defied logic. One day, it was a functioning home, a supposed beacon of charity in the wilds of western Massachusetts. The next, it was a silent tomb. Delivery driver arriving with provisions the following morning had found the place deserted. The dining hall was set for breakfast, porridge still in the bowls, milk in the glasses. The beds in the dormitories were unmade, as if their occupants had just risen for the day. But everyone was gone, vanished. The investigation, a rudimentary affair of local constables and bewildered state officials, hit a wall of absolute silence. There was no sign of a struggle, no ransom note, no tracks leading away from the property. It was a perfect, seamless vanishing. The official theory, settled upon out of sheer desperation, was a mass kidnapping, likely by a ring of gypsies or vagrants, a convenient and untraceable scapegoat for the era. But the story never felt right. The scale of it, the silence, the sheer logistical impossibility of spiriting away 40 people from an isolated location without a single trace, it all pointed to something else. The case went cold, the story faded from the papers, and Blackwood was left to rot on its lonely hill, becoming little more than a ghost story to frighten local children. But the ghost had hooked into my mind. 33 children. The number felt biblical, apocalyptic. My research hit dead end after dead end, until I shifted my focus from the disappearance itself to the orphanage's foundation. It wasn't a state-run entity. Its funding was entirely private, sourced from a mysterious consortium of wealthy Boston industrialists. They called themselves the Ethel Red Circle. Their public charter was a masterpiece of progressive rhetoric, speaking of providing destitute children with a sound mind and a sound body, grounded in the principles of nature and reason. But a deeper dive into their members' other interests revealed a shared obsession with the esoteric, with hermetic philosophies, with the occult. The thread I was pulling was leading me from a simple cold case into a much darker, more labyrinthine world. Before making the drive west, I decided to consult an expert. Dr. Alistair Finch was a legend in certain academic circles and a pariah in others. A retired Harvard historian, he was the foremost and perhaps only authority on New England's fringe religious movements and forgotten cults. He lived in a cluttered Beacon Hill brownstone that seemed less a home and more a library that had begrudgingly allowed a human to move in. The air in his study was thick with the rich, sweet smell of pipe tobacco, old leather, and whiskey. Books were not just on shelves. They were in towering, precarious stacks on the floor, on his desk, on every available surface. Finch was a man in his late 80s, a frail, stooped figure with a shock of white hair, but his eyes, behind thick, round spectacles, burned with a fierce, undimmed intelligence. He listened patiently as I laid out my research on the floor between us, the photocopied articles and records forming a mosaic of tragedy. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment, steepling his long, arthritic fingers. Blackwood, he finally mused, his voice a dry, rustling sound like turning pages. And the ethyl-red circle. You are, if you will forgive the metaphor, digging in a deep and particularly dangerous well, Mr. Morrison. I seem to be the only one digging at all, I replied. The story's been buried for over 30 years. Some stories are not buried, they are interred, Finch corrected me gently. There is a difference. One implies forgetting, the other implies containment. He rose slowly from his wing-backed chair and shuffled over to a teetering stack of books, pulling a heavy, leather-bound volume from the middle with a practiced ease that defied its weight. The ethyl-red circle was not unique in its time. The late 19th century was a hotbed of spiritualism, theosophy, a great turning away from the perceived inadequacies of orthodox religion towards something older, something more transactional. He placed the book on the desk and opened it. The pages were filled with strange, hand-drawn diagrams, astrological charts, and what looked like mathematical equations intertwined with runes. The industrialists of the Gilded Age were men who had conquered the material world, he explained, his finger tracing a complex, spiraling symbol. They had bent steel and steam and finance to their will. Having done so, they found themselves confronting the one adversary they could not outmaneuver, their own mortality. They saw death not as a natural conclusion, but as a design flaw, an engineering problem to be solved. And the circle thought they had the solution? I asked, my gaze fixed on the unsettling diagrams. They believed they did. Their founder, a man named Julian Ashcroft, was a brilliant but deeply disturbed individual. His private writings, some of which I have had the dubious pleasure of reading, are filled with the idea that the universe is not governed by a benevolent God, but by ancient, indifferent principles. He believed our reality is just one layer among many, and that the veil between them is not a wall, but a membrane that could be punctured, and through which one could bargain. Bargain with what? A patron entity, Finch said, his voice dropping almost to a whisper. He never names it directly, a sign of true fear, perhaps. He refers to it by several kennings: the collector of moments, the silent tithe-taker, the hunger in the void. He believed this entity was drawn to and fed upon a specific kind of energy, a resonance that could only be found in profound, uncorrupted life force, untainted by the cynicism and compromise of adult life. The blood drained from my face. Children, I said, the word feeling like a shard of glass in my throat. Finch gave a slow, sad nod. The purest source, the most potent fuel. Blackwood Orphanage was never about charity, Mr. Morrison. It was a larder, a meticulously curated farm, a place to gather the ingredients for a ritual of unimaginable arrogance and horror, a ritual of transference. Transference of what? Life force, time itself. They believed they could offer the collected essence of those children to the entity in exchange for an unnaturally extended lifespan. They would burn the children's brief, bright candles to keep their own dimming flames from going out. He pointed to a list of names in the book. Ashcroft himself died in 1905, supposedly of a heart attack, though his physician noted he had the constitution of a man 20 years his junior. The other core members of the circle, they all lived into their 90s, well into the 1940s and 50s. They outlived their wives, their children, their contemporaries, like ancient trees in a field of saplings. The pact, it would seem, was honored. A heavy silence fell over the room. The cheerful ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner sounded like a death knell. "Go home, Mr. Morrison," Finch said at last, his voice gentle but firm. "I mean it. Some stories are tombs. To open them is not to solve a mystery, but to release the disease that killed the occupant. The silence that surrounds the Blackwood affair is not one of ignorance. It is a quarantine. Let it be." Finch's warning was a cold stone in my gut, but it was too late. The disease was already in my blood. His words didn't dissuade me. They galvanized me. This was no longer just a cold case. It was a story about a monster, and I had to see the monster's lair for myself. The drive west was a pilgrimage into a forgotten America. The polished, bustling suburbs of Boston gave way to proud, working-class towns, which in turn bled into sleepy farming communities where time seemed to move at a slower pace. The main roads narrowed, the pavement cracked and gave way to gravel. The final leg of the journey was a dirt track that my Ford could not handle, a path being steadily reclaimed by the encroaching forest. I left the car and began to walk, the modern world receding with every step. The forest here was different. The trees were older, their branches thick and tangled, forming a dense canopy that plunged the path into a perpetual twilight. The air grew still and heavy, and the cheerful sounds of birds and insects faded away, replaced by an unnerving silence. It felt like I was walking on the floor of a deep green ocean. After a mile, the path began to climb, and through a break in the trees, I saw it. The orphanage stood on a hill that seemed unnaturally barren, a stark gray anomaly in the surrounding sea of green. It was a 3-story Victorian Gothic nightmare, all sharp angles, steep gables, and a single lonely tower that clawed at the overcast sky. It seemed to be leaning, as if exhausted by the sheer weight of its own history. As I approached, a profound sense of wrongness washed over me, a feeling that this place was an error in the landscape, a blasphemy against nature. The wrought iron gate, with its snarling B for Blackwood, hung open on a single groaning hinge. The path beyond was choked with weeds, the stone crumbling. I walked up to the grand front door, its oak surface bleached gray and splintered by decades of harsh winters. It was slightly ajar. I placed my hand on the cold wood and pushed. It swung open with a low, prolonged groan, a sound of deep and ancient protest. The air that flowed out was a physical presence. It was cold, but not the clean cold of the forest. This was a damp, cellar cold, thick with the smell of mildew, wet rot, and something else. A faint, sickly sweet odor like old flowers and forgotten grief. I hesitated on the threshold, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But the ghoul in me was stronger. I stepped inside, my flashlight beam cutting a nervous path through the gloom. I found myself in a cavernous grand hall. Dust, as fine and gray as volcanic ash, lay in a thick, undisturbed blanket over everything. It covered the checkered marble floor, the ornate wainscoting, the once grand furniture that now huddled like shrouded ghosts against the walls. A majestic dual staircase, its banisters webbed in gossamer tapestries of silk so thick they looked like cotton, swept upwards into a darkness so complete it felt solid. The silence was absolute, a pressurized void that seemed to suck the very sound from my lungs. I felt like an intruder in a pharaoh's tomb, a vulgar trespasser in a place of sacred sorrow. I started my exploration on the ground floor, my boots leaving the first footprints this place had seen in a generation. The dining hall was a scene of chaos frozen in time. Small wooden chairs were overturned, a few still lying beside tables set for a breakfast that was never eaten. In the cavernous kitchen, I found the source of the sweet, rotten smell. Sacks of potatoes and onions had liquefied into dark, putrid sludge in a corner pantry. A cast-iron pot on the massive wood-burning stove held a carbonized black mass that might once have been oatmeal. It was a place where life had not just ended, but had been violently interrupted, mid-breath. The most unsettling room was the classroom. Desks were arranged in neat rows, facing a large blackboard. The board was covered in the faint, ghostly remnants of children's handwriting, lessons on arithmetic and grammar. But in one corner, a child had drawn a picture. It depicted a series of small stick figures, all holding hands. Towering over them was another figure, this one unnaturally tall and thin, with long, spindly arms. It had no face, just a smooth, blank oval. Beneath it, a single, childishly scrawled word, collector. My blood ran cold. The word from Finch's books, from Eleanor's philosophy, was here, scrawled by the hand of a child who was now long gone. This was real. I knew the heart of the operation, the source of the story, would be in the director's office. I ascended the grand staircase, my hand trailing on the dusty, web-choked banister. The second floor was a long, straight corridor, a tunnel of shadow. The air up here was heavier, colder, thick with a palpable sense of loss. I passed door after door, most locked tight. The few that were open revealed small Spartan dormitories. Each one was a fresh heartbreak. A single, worn teddy bear lying on a thin mattress. A pair of small, scuffed boots placed neatly at the foot of an iron bed. A child's music box, its lid open, frozen mid-song. These small, intimate details of lost lives were more terrifying than any overt haunting. At the very end of the corridor, I found the door I was looking for. The brass plate was tarnished nearly black, but the name was still legible. Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood, headmistress. My hand trembled as I turned the cold, stiff knob. The door swung open into an office that was a perfect, dust-shrouded shrine to its former occupant. A massive mahogany desk stood as an altar in the center of the room. Shelves filled with leather-bound books lined the walls. A tall, imposing chair with a high back faced away from the door, as if its owner had just stood up. My flashlight beam swept across the desk, an ornate inkwell, its ink long since turned to black dust. Ledgers filled with neat, precise columns of figures. And there, partially hidden beneath a crumbling account book, was another volume. It was larger, bound in black leather with no title on its spine. It felt different. I reached out and pulled it free. The leather was cold and unnervingly supple. I opened it to the first page. The elegant, looping cursive was as clear as the day it was written. The private diary of Eleanor Blackwood, property of the Circle. I sank into the visitor's chair, oblivious to the cloud of dust that erupted around me, and began to read. For hours I sat there, the world outside ceasing to exist, the only light the trembling beam of my flashlight, the only sound my own ragged breathing. I descended, page by page, into the cold, methodical madness of Eleanor Blackwood's mind, a journey through her twisted philosophy, her arrogant justifications, her meticulous planning for the great work. I read about her contempt for the fleeting, sentimental nature of human life, and her ecstatic descriptions of the timeless, silent beauty of the collector. My horror grew with every page, but it was a detached, intellectual horror. This was a story I was reading, a historical evil. It wasn't until I reached the final entries describing the successful harvest that the paper slipped out, the folded yellowed sheet, the list, the one titled, The Harvest Tithe. My beam shook as I scanned the 33 names, each with its neat final checkmark, and then I saw it. The 34th name at the bottom of the page, the name crossed out with a single violent slash of ink, a wound on the paper. Martha Mayhew, my great-grandmother, and next to it the 4 words that took the story from the past and slammed it into my present. The 4 words that explained the whispers I sometimes heard in my own family's history, the nightmares my great-grandmother could never describe, the 4 words that sealed my fate. The bloodline escaped. It was in that precise moment, as the history of my own blood was rewritten in a dusty, dead office, as I realized I was not just an investigator, but a living, breathing loose end to this horrific tale, that the 33 years of silence in the Blackwood Orphanage finally broke. A whisper, woven from the voices of children and the dust of ages, slithered from the dark corridor behind me. It was not a hostile sound. It was a sound of recognition, of discovery, and it whispered the name that now felt like a curse. Morrison. The whisper of my own surname, Morrison, spoken by the dead in the suffocating darkness of that house, was not just a sound. It was a key turning in a lock deep inside me, opening a door to a kind of fear I had never known. The academic, detached horror I had felt while reading the diary was incinerated in an instant, replaced by the raw, animal terror of being prey. The story was no longer on the page. It was in the hall. It was hunting me. My reaction was not one of thought, but of pure, lizard-brained instinct. I scrambled backwards away from the door, my hip slamming into the corner of Eleanor's heavy mahogany desk. Pain flared, a sharp grounding sensation in the swirling vortex of my panic. The whispers were louder now, a sibilant chorus seeming to seep from the floral patterns on the peeling wallpaper, from the cracks in the plaster ceiling. The debt, the blood has returned. The circle must be complete. It was the sound of a patient hunger that had waited for 33 years and was now presented with its long overdue meal. I fumbled with the heavy iron lock on the inside of the office door. my fingers numb and clumsy, and slid the bolt home. It was a laughably futile gesture, a child's defense against the encroaching night, but it was the only action my terrified mind could conceive. I backed away, pressing myself into the far corner of the room, my flashlight beam a trembling, pathetic sword against the oppressive darkness. Then came the scratching. It was a slow, deliberate sound on the other side of the door. Not the frantic scrabbling of a beast, but the patient, methodical sound of dozens of small, sharp fingernails dragging down the ancient wood. It was the sound of children wanting to be let in. I clapped my hands over my ears, but it did no good. The sound seemed to vibrate directly into my skull. The scratching stopped. It was replaced by a new sound, one that was somehow even more terrifying. The heavy, dragging footsteps of a single adult. They stopped directly outside the door. A voice, the one I now associated with the cold, precise cursive in the diary, spoke. It was a voice that didn't need to shout. Its power was in its chilling, conversational calm. "The circle has been patient," the voice of Eleanor Blackwood sighed through the wood. "The final note must be added to the song. The collector does not forget a debt." The doorknob began to turn, a slow, grinding rotation, the metal groaning in protest. That was the final stimulus my paralyzed body needed. I was no longer a journalist or a historian. I was an animal in a trap, and I would chew off my own leg to get free. My eyes darted around the room and landed on the tall, grime-caked window. It was my only way out. I grabbed the heavy oak visitor's chair, its weight a surprising anchor in my panic. With a guttural cry that was equal parts fear and rage, I swung it like a battering ram. The first blow sent a spiderweb of cracks across the ancient brittle glass, the sound shockingly loud in the charged silence. The whispers in the room rose in pitch, becoming a chorus of angry hisses. "No! The vessel!" I swung again, putting every ounce of my terror-fueled strength into the blow. The window exploded outwards in a shower of glass and rotten wood, the sound a beautiful, liberating crack of thunder. The cold night air, smelling of damp earth and life and freedom, rushed in, a blessed violation of the tomb's stagnant atmosphere. Behind me, the office door shuddered in its frame, a loud crack appearing in the wood. I didn't wait to see it give way. I tossed the precious diary and the folklore book out onto the dark, sloping roof of a veranda below. Then, without a second thought, I clambered through the jagged opening. Shards of glass tore at my clothes and sliced my hands, the sharp, clean pain a welcome distraction from the formless terror behind me. I landed heavily on the slick, moss-covered shingles of the veranda roof. For a moment I teetered there, one story above the overgrown grounds, the moonlight casting the world in a ghostly silver and black. The office door behind me finally burst open with a splintering crash. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see what stood in that doorway. I launched myself off the roof, a desperate leap of faith into the darkness. My fall was broken by a large, overgrown rhododendron bush. Its branches whipped at me, tearing at my face and clothes, but they cushioned my landing. I hit the soft earth with a jarring thud that knocked the wind from my lungs. I lay there for a moment, stunned, gasping for air, the smell of crushed leaves and chlorophyll filling my senses. A whisper from the broken window above, "He is ours, he cannot escape the blood," spurred me to my feet. I scooped up the 2 books, my only trophies from that hell house, and I ran. I didn't follow the path. I plunged into the deep, tangled woods that bordered the property, crashing through undergrowth, thorns catching at my clothes, the darkness of the forest a welcoming cloak. I ran blindly, fueled by pure adrenaline, until the menacing silhouette of the orphanage was lost behind the trees, until my lungs felt as if they were filled with fire, and my legs were numb, rubbery stilts. I finally collapsed at the foot of a massive oak tree, my back sliding down its rough bark, and I finally allowed myself to tremble, my body racked with violent, uncontrollable shudders. I had escaped the house. But as I sat there in the cold, clean silence of the woods, the terror slowly subsided, replaced by a chilling, intellectual certainty. The house was just a vessel, an amplifier. The real curse, the real connection, was in the blood that was still humming with terror through my own veins. I hadn't escaped anything. I had just taken the haunting with me. The next few weeks were a study in paranoia. I found a cheap, anonymous motel on a highway 2 towns away, a place of buzzing neon signs, stained carpets, and the constant lonely rumble of passing trucks. It felt like the safest place on earth. I paid in cash and slept with a heavy chair wedged under the doorknob, but sleep offered no refuge. It was a recurring nightmare, a private screening of the same horrifying film every night. I would be standing in the grand hall of the orphanage, but it would be clean, pristine, filled with the laughter of children. The 33 would be there, playing tag, their faces bright and full of life. But when they saw me, they would stop, a slow, shared smile spreading across their faces. And as they approached, their features would melt away like wax, leaving only those smooth, blank voids of skin. And they would all reach for me, their collective whisper a tidal wave in my mind. "It's your turn. Join the song." I'd awaken drenched in a cold sweat, my own scream caught in my throat, the phantom whispers seeming to linger in the corners of the dingy motel room. I existed on black coffee and a gnawing fear, starting at every shadow, every unexpected noise. I kept the lights on at all hours, the small television blaring static, anything to keep the silence at bay. But the silence always found the cracks, and in the silence I felt it, the sense of being watched, a cold spot in the room, a flicker of movement at the edge of my vision. My only anchor in this swirling vortex of encroaching madness was the 2 books I had stolen from the house. They were my tormentors, and my only hope. I dedicated every waking hour to them, my fingers tracing the lines of Eleanor's arrogant script and the cryptic diagrams in the folklore book. I was no longer just a journalist. I was a man desperately searching for the schematics of his own prison. Eleanor's diary became my primary focus. I needed to understand the monster to have any hope of fighting it. Her later entries were a descent into a kind of cosmic fanaticism that was both brilliant and utterly insane. She wrote about the collector not as a devil or a demon in the traditional sense, but as a fundamental force of the universe, like gravity or entropy. From the Diary of Eleanor Blackwood, September 1st, 1892. The circle grows impatient. Brother Albright speaks of his conscience, the fool. Conscience is a luxury of the ephemeral. We are striving for permanence. They do not comprehend the beauty of the collector. It is not evil. A black hole is not evil. It is simply a truth of physics. The collector is a truth of metaphysics. It is a sentient void, a hunger for resonance, for the bright, chaotic energy of life that disrupts the perfect, silent equilibrium of eternity. It does not hate. It does not love. It merely balances. It consumes the noise of life to restore the purity of silence. The decision to go back was not born of courage. Courage is what you feel when you have a chance of winning. This was different. It was a cold, hard resignation, the grim calculus of a man with no other moves left on the board. To run was to be haunted forever, a slow, agonizing decay of the soul. To return was to face a probable death, but on my own terms, with a sliver of a chance to end the nightmare not just for myself, but for the 33 souls trapped in its gears. I chose the finality of the fight over the eternity of the flight. My preparations were those of a soldier going on a suicide mission. I packed a sturdy canvas bag with essentials, 2 powerful, heavy-duty lanterns with spare batteries, a length of thick rope, a small first aid kit, a crowbar, and the small, sharp knife I had bought from a hardware store. And of course the 2 books that had become my Bible and my burden, Eleanor's diary and the folklore text. Tucked into my shirt pocket, resting against my heart, was the small, cheap journal of Agnes Mayhew, my great-great-grandmother. And around my neck, cool against my skin, was the silver locket. It was no longer just a piece of jewelry. It was a weapon, a key, and a prayer. The drive back to the Blackwood estate was a funereal procession. I drove through the night, the darkness of the road matching the grim resolve in my heart. This time I felt no fear of the encroaching woods, no dread of the oppressive silence. I had already walked through the fire. Now I was just returning to sift through the ashes for the source of the blaze. I parked my car where the dirt track began and made my way up the hill, the beam of my lantern cutting a determined path through the darkness. The ruins of the orphanage were even more desolate by moonlight. A jagged skeleton of charred beams and crumbled stone, it looked like the carcass of some great beast that had finally succumbed to its own internal sickness. The air was still, but it no longer felt watchful. It felt empty, exhausted. The lesser spirits, the echoes of daily life, had been scoured away by my last escape. But I knew the primary infection, the core of the disease, still festered deep within the earth below. Finding the cellar entrance again amidst the chaos of the rubble was a grueling task. For over an hour I heaved aside splintered timbers and heavy blocks of masonry, my muscles straining, my hands raw even through thick work gloves. The work was a kind of penance, a physical exertion that focused my mind and kept the fear at bay. Finally, the beam of my lantern caught the glint of iron, the ring set into the heavy stone slab. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it, the way down. With the crowbar as a lever, I put all my weight into the effort, groaning as the slab scraped against the surrounding rock. It lifted, revealing a square of perfect, impenetrable blackness. A wave of cold, stagnant air, smelling of damp soil and a faint electric tang of ozone, rose up to meet me. It was the smell of a place that had never known the sun. Securing my rope to the base of a sturdy, fire-hardened beam, I threw the other end down into the darkness and began my descent. I landed softly on the earthen floor of the lower sanctuary. The circular, man-made cavern was exactly as I remembered it, a place outside of time. I swept my lantern beam across the smooth stone walls, illuminating the strange, unsettling constellations and geometric patterns carved into them. They seemed to mock the true stars in the sky above, a twisted cosmology of a private, insane religion. My light finally came to rest on the center of the floor, on the sigil. It was a complex, spiraling symbol etched into the stone with unnerving precision, a vortex of interlocking lines and unfamiliar runes. It seemed to squirm at the edge of my vision, an optical illusion that made my stomach churn. It was a doorway, a cosmic drain, and I could feel a low, subliminal thrumming emanating from it, a silent vibration that I felt more in my bones than heard with my ears. This was the heart of the curse, the anchor point of the collector's influence. I took a deep breath, the cold air burning my lungs. I walked slowly towards the center of the room, my boots making no sound on the packed earth. I felt a strange sense of calm, the quiet focus that comes when there are no more choices to be made. I had the knowledge from the books, I had the locket, and I had the blood. I had everything I needed. The moment my foot touched the outer edge of the carved sigil, the trap was sprung. The thrumming intensified, rising from a subliminal vibration into an audible, low-frequency hum that made my teeth ache. The air in the cavern grew frigid, my breath pluming in the beam of my lantern. And from the walls themselves, the whispers began. Not the sorrowful, pleading whispers from the house, but something more primal, more ancient. It was the sound of the void itself, a chorus of emptiness that promised nothing but oblivion. Then from the shadows at the perimeter of the cavern, they began to coalesce. The 33. They emerged not as half-formed specters, but as solid, terrifying manifestations, their forms flickering violently as if caught between two worlds. They were dressed in their simple 19th-century clothes, but their faces were distorted, their features blurred and indistinct, their eyes burning with a cold, hungry green light. They were no longer the sad prisoners of the house. Here, at the source of their power, they were its guardians. They linked hands, forming a silent, tightening circle around me, their collective gaze a physical weight. From the very center of the sigil, a taller, more defined form began to rise, gathering the shadows to it like a cloak. The specter of Eleanor Blackwood materialized, no longer the translucent echo from the office, but a being of pure, solidified malice. Her face was a mask of triumphant, contemptuous fury, her eyes glowing with the same sickly green light as the children's. "The fool returns to the abattoir," she hissed, her voice a layered chorus that seemed to echo from every corner of the cavern. "You have saved us the trouble of hunting you down through the tedious years. You have brought the final ingredient to the altar yourself, a display of arrogance that almost rivals my own." I stood my ground, my hand closing around the locket at my neck. "This isn't your altar, Eleanor. It was never yours. You just squatted on someone else's holy ground and corrupted it." She let out a laugh that sounded like grinding stones. "Holy. This place has always been a place of hunger. The old ones who came before were weak. They tried to placate the collector with trinkets and chants. I understood its true nature. I offered it a meal worthy of its stature. And in return it offered us the one thing that matters, freedom from the vulgar tyranny of time. You call this freedom? I shot back, gesturing to the circle of trapped, flickering souls. You didn't free anyone. You built your immortality on a foundation of their stolen lives. They aren't your partners, they're your fuel. Semantics, she shrieked, her form flaring with rage. They serve a glorious purpose. They are part of a work that will outlast civilizations. And you carry the tainted blood of the flaw in the design. A sentimental kitchen maid and her squalling brat upset a perfect equation. Tonight we correct the math. The collector will feast on your resonant bloodline, the pact will be perfected, and we will finally have the perfect eternal silence we were promised. As she spoke, the humming from the children intensified. The sigil on the floor began to glow, its lines burning with a virulent green energy. The psychic pressure in the room became immense, a crushing weight on my mind, and then the assault began. It was not physical, it was worse. The cavern walls seemed to dissolve, and I was no longer in a cellar. I was in a sunlit field. My great-grandmother, Martha, stood before me, not as the old woman I remembered, but as a young, terrified mother. She was pointing an accusing finger at me. "You led it to us," she wept, her voice filled with spectral sorrow. "Why did you come? Why did you stir the silence?" Then the scene shifted. I saw the faces of the 33 children, not as monsters, but as they were in the photographs, innocent and afraid. They weren't whispering threats, they were crying. Why didn't she take us too? Why were we left behind? They were trying to break me with guilt, to drown me in the sorrow of the past. Eleanor's voice echoed through the illusion. "Join them, Arthur. Give them what they want. It is a mercy. End their suffering. End your own." I gritted my teeth, the locket hot in my fist. "No," I said, my voice a ragged gasp. "This isn't them. It's you. It's your poison." I squeezed my eyes shut, focusing on the memory of Agnes Mayhew's diary, on her words of fierce, protective love. I focused on the faces from the photographs, on my duty to them. The illusion flickered, the sunlit field dissolving back into the cold, damp stone of the cavern. I had weathered the first attack. Eleanor's face was contorted in a snarl of frustration. "Stubborn blood. Then you shall be taken by force." The circle of children began to advance, their hands still linked, the circle shrinking around me. They moved not with the clumsy steps of children, but with the smooth, gliding motion of sharks. The green light from their eyes intensified, and I felt my own energy, my life force being pulled from me, drawn towards the glowing sigil. It was a cold, draining sensation, a spiritual exsanguination. This was it. Now or never. "You're wrong about them, Eleanor," I shouted, my voice ringing with a conviction I didn't know I had. I wasn't just speaking to her anymore. I was speaking to the trapped souls. "She told you that you were serving a great purpose, but she lied. Look at her. Does she share your prison? No, she used you. She turned you into slaves, into batteries to power her own selfish existence. She stole your lives so she could hoard a few more miserable years for herself. The collector doesn't want you. It wants her. Her pact is the only thing keeping you tethered to this place." A flicker of confusion seemed to pass through the circle. One of the children, the one who looked like the boy Thomas from the photograph, hesitated. His form wavered. For a split second, the green fire in his eyes dimmed. Eleanor saw it. "Lies! He seeks to divide us. Obey!" she commanded. The circle solidified, their advance resuming. I knew I only had seconds. I fought my way toward the center of the circle. The locket held out before me like a plow. The spirits recoiled from its gentle light, hissing, but the sheer force of their combined will was immense. It was like wading through molasses. Finally, I reached the center of the cavern and stood directly over the heart of the glowing sigil. The draining sensation intensified. My vision began to blur at the edges. I fell to one knee, my strength failing. Eleanor loomed over me, a triumphant, demonic grin on her spectral face. "It is over." "You're right," I gasped, pulling the small knife from my pocket. With my last ounce of strength, I knelt down. I placed the silver locket, with its photograph of a survivor, directly onto the central rune of the sigil. Then, I drew the sharp blade across the palm of my hand. The cut was deep, the pain a welcome grounding shock. I turned my hand over and clenched my fist, letting my blood, the blood of the escaped bloodline, the blood of Agnes's courage and Martha's survival, drip down onto the locket, sizzling as it hit the glowing stone. A willing sacrifice, A debt paid not in fear or coercion, but in love and remembrance. A paradox. The reaction was not an explosion, it was an implosion. The moment my blood completed the circuit, the sigil did not flare. It died. The green light vanished, sucked into a point of absolute silent blackness that erupted from beneath the locket. A soundless scream tore through the cavern, the scream of a concept being negated, of a pact being rendered fundamentally void. The blackness spread, a wave of anti-light, a tangible void that did not destroy but unmade. Eleanor shrieked, a sound of pure, undiluted agony as the void washed over her. Her form was stretched, distorted, and then erased from existence like a line of chalk wiped from a blackboard. Her final, surprised expression was one of utter annihilation. The circle of children broke. The draining sensation stopped. The green light in their eyes was extinguished, replaced by a soft white glow. They looked at me, their blurred features resolving for a moment into the clear faces from the photographs. They were just children again. They didn't speak, but I felt a wave of profound, overwhelming gratitude, a collective sigh of release that echoed in the deepest parts of my soul. Then, one by one, they faded, not into darkness, but into light, like smoke from a snuffed candle rising into the morning sun. They were free. The cavern began to shake violently. The ancient magic that had held it together was gone. The ceiling cracked, and stones began to rain down. The entire structure was collapsing. Scrambled to my feet, retrieved my locket, now strangely cool to the touch, and ran for the steps. I burst out into the ruins under the night sky just as the ground gave way behind me, the lower sanctuary caving in with a deafening roar, burying the cursed sigil forever under tons of rock and earth. I staggered away from the rubble, my body bruised and bleeding, my mind a hollowed-out chamber of exhaustion and awe. I had done it. It was over. The weeks that followed were quiet. For the first time since I'd first read the name Blackwood, my mind was silent. The nightmares ceased. The paranoia faded. The feeling of being watched was gone, replaced by a profound and peaceful sense of solitude. I wrote the story, not for a newspaper, but for myself, a final testimony to the 33 and to the 2 women in my family who had started and ended the fight. I had looked into the abyss, and for once, the abyss had blinked first. It's been 6 months now. I moved to a small apartment by the sea, the sound of the waves a constant cleansing presence. I thought the story was over, a closed chapter in a book I could finally put on the shelf. I was wrong. Last night, I was cleaning some of my old things, and I picked up the locket. I polished the silver surface, my thumb tracing its smooth, familiar shape, and then I saw something I had never noticed before, something that my exhausted mind must have refused to register in the aftermath. There, on the back of the locket, was a crack, a thin, black hairline fracture starting from the edge and ending near the center. It must have happened when I slammed it onto the altar, when it had absorbed the cataclysmic energy of the broken pact. I felt a small, cold prickle of unease but dismissed it. It was just a crack, a scar, a reminder. I put the locket on my bedside table and went to sleep. The silence was as peaceful as ever. But this morning, as I was making coffee, a whisper as soft as the breeze through my open window brushed against my ear. It was not the sorrowful whisper of the children. It was something else, something ancient, patient, and deeply, deeply curious. It said, "Anchor." I dropped my cup, shattering it on the floor. I finally understand. I didn't destroy the collector. How can you destroy a concept like hunger? I had only destroyed its anchor to that place. By using my own blood, the blood of the unique bloodline, to break the curse, I had inadvertently offered the ancient entity a new one, a mobile one. The evil is no longer tied to a blighted hill in Massachusetts. It's tied to me. The silence I've been enjoying wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of a predator that has finally acquired its prey and no longer needs to hunt. I don't know what comes next, but the story isn't over. New chapter has just begun, and this time there is nowhere left to run. This cold, detached worldview was more terrifying than any tale of a fanged monster. How do you fight a law of physics? How do you reason with a black hole? Her writings also detailed the true nature of the pact. The children's souls weren't just a meal that was consumed and gone. The ritual of the sigil had been designed to be more efficient. October 20th, 1892. The binding is the true genius of Ashcroft's design. We do not merely offer a fleeting meal. We are creating a permanent conduit, a tether. The souls of the 33 will not be extinguished. They will be transmuted. Woven into the fabric of the thin place, they will become eternal batteries, resonating at a frequency that will anchor the collector's influence here and power our own transcendence. They will be the eternal heart, and we, the circle, shall be the immortal mind. Their sacrifice is not an end, but a transformation into a state of perpetual, glorious purpose. I felt a wave of nausea. The children were not just ghosts. They were prisoners, their spiritual energy being siphoned to power the unnaturally long lives of a cabal of psychopaths. They were the engine of the curse, and because my bloodline represented an imperfection in that engine, a missing component, their trapped energy was focused, by its very nature, on finding me. They were not haunting me out of malice. They were haunting me out of a terrible cosmic necessity. A few nights after this revelation, my desperation must have reached a peak. I fell into an exhausted, feverish sleep, and the dream was different. I wasn't in the grand hall, I was upstairs in the long, dark corridor. I was drawn to the dormitory at the end of the hall, the one with the rocking horse. The door was open. From inside, I could hear a small, heartbreaking sob. In the dream, I was no longer afraid, only filled with a profound sense of pity. I stepped into the room. A single little girl, dressed in a simple white nightgown, was sitting on one of the iron frame beds, her back to me, her small shoulders shaking with her crying. The moonlight from the window bathed her in a silvery glow. "What's wrong?" I asked, my voice gentle. She stopped crying. Slowly her head turned. "He won't let us sleep," she whispered, her voice a reedy, sorrowful echo. "Who won't?" I asked, taking a step closer. "The collector," she sighed, and then she turned fully to face me. The scream I let out was silent, a vacuum in my lungs. Where her face should have been, there was only that smooth, blank, featureless expanse of skin. It floated towards me, its small hands outstretched. "Stay with us," it whispered. "Complete the song. Then we can all sleep." I scrambled backwards, falling over one of the iron beds. The blank-faced thing kept coming, its movements unnaturally smooth. It was no longer a child, it was a symbol of loss, an avatar of the void. My hand instinctively went to my chest, to the small lump under my shirt. I pulled out the silver locket my great-grandmother had given me. It was a desperate, meaningless gesture, a prayer, but it wasn't meaningless. The moment I held it out, the silver locket began to glow. It wasn't a bright, explosive light, but a soft, warm, gentle luminescence like a captured piece of dawn. The blank-faced entity recoiled as if struck, a hiss of static escaping from where its mouth should have been. It raised its hands to shield its featureless face from the gentle light. The form flickered violently, like a faulty projection, and then dissolved back into the shadows. I was left alone in the silent, moonlit dormitory, my heart pounding, clutching the locket which was now warm and pulsing with a faint rhythmic light against my palm. It was a weapon. I didn't understand how or why, but this simple, sentimental object held a power that the horrors of this house could not abide. It was the first glimmer of hope I'd had since this nightmare began. It was the first time I felt I could fight back. The next day, my discovery was confirmed. I had taken to carrying the 2 books with me everywhere, wrapped in a towel in the trunk of my car, while rereading the folklore book, searching for any mention of silver or light. A small, thin booklet fell from between its pages. It must have been used as a bookmark by Eleanor and forgotten. It was not a printed book. It was a cheap, simple journal, its cover made of worn cardboard. The handwriting inside was not Eleanor's elegant script. It was a simple, slightly clumsy cursive, filled with grammatical errors and raw emotion. The first page read, "The Diary of Agnes Mayhew, my great-great-grandmother, the kitchen maid." My hands trembled as I read. Her entries painted a terrifying, heartbreaking picture from the other side of the veil of power. She wrote not of cosmic pacts, but of a growing human fear. April 12th, 1892. The mistress is not right in her head. The way she looks at the children, it is not with love. It is like a farmer looking at his prize cattle before the slaughter. She and the men who visit, the ones in their fine suits who call themselves the Circle, they meet in the cellar. I hear their chanting sometimes when I am cleaning the kitchens late at night. It is not a sound of God. October 30th, 1892. My little Martha has a cough. The mistress offered her a special tonic. I threw it out. There is a look in her eyes now when she sees my Martha, a hungry look. She speaks of a great harvest that is coming. The other staff, they are believers. They look at me with suspicion. They think I am a simpleton. I am afraid, not for myself, but for my child. Then, the final frantic entry, scrawled across 2 pages in a barely legible rush. November 16, 1892. God have mercy on us. I was hiding in the pantry. I heard them, the men of the circle, and the mistress. Tonight. They are planning to do it tonight. They have sedatives for the milk. A painless transformation, she called it. A sacrifice to their silent God. My Martha is on their list. The final one. I cannot let them take her. I am taking her now. We will run. We will run into the woods and not stop. All I have is the silver locket my own mother gave me, with a prayer locked inside. It is all the protection I can offer her. May the Lord forgive me for what I have seen and what I am about to do. But they will not have my child. I closed the small journal, my eyes blurred with tears. The story was finally complete. The locket wasn't just a symbol of my great-grandmother's survival. It was the instrument of it. It was a talisman of a mother's fierce, desperate, selfless love. And that love, I now understood, was the one force in the universe that the cold, selfish hunger of the collector could not comprehend. It was a light that could blind it, a fire that could burn it. It was my only weapon. I stood up and looked at my reflection in the cheap, warped mirror of the motel room. The man who looked back was a pale, haunted stranger with wild eyes. But for the first time, there was something else there too. A flicker of resolve, a spark of anger. Running was no longer an option. Hiding was a slow death sentence. The whispers were tied to my blood, and they would follow me to the ends of the earth. The nightmares, the cold spots, the feeling of being watched. It was the curse testing its connection, pulling me back. There was only one way to end this. It wasn't enough to have escaped the house. I had to destroy the evil at its root. I had to go back to Blackwood. I had to find the lower sanctuary and the sigil she wrote about. I had to take the fight to them. My fear was still there, a cold, heavy stone in my gut, but it was no longer in control. I was no longer the prey fleeing in the dark. I was now the hunter, armed with the truth and with a locket filled with a love strong enough to defy a god. I was going back to finish the story my great-great-grandmother had started. I was going to burn the Blackwood legacy to the ground.